Live. I'm really excited to have Cleo Pahlmeyer as my guest today. I think this is going to be a really fascinating and educational seminar. Cleo, I think we're on I don't know why, I think I must have gotten the Sonoma Coast bug because we had like John Raytek on and Thomas Brown with his wines a couple days ago, now you, so there must be something that's percolating in my head, maybe just having published views or something, I don't know, but it's great to have you on. Thanks for being here.
Of course. Thank you so much for having me. This is going to be fun.
Yeah. And well, first and foremost, obviously we're in a very crazy, tumultuous time. So, as you know, we like to do these seminars as a way of kind of, trying to keep us all somewhat connected, even though we're all in our own little realities for a little while longer at least. But I hope you and your family are doing well and your team is safe out there.
We are. Thank you so much for asking. Yes, we are very fortunate.
Yeah. So we've got some wines to talk about. You've got a really cool project. And one thing that I'd like to encourage people to do is to start giving us your questions right away so that we can weave them in. Sometimes we get all the questions at the end and then it's like this race to try to answer them. And we really want this to be interactive. And we always get great questions. And so that's really why we're here, the two of us, to sort of to answer those questions as much as possible, mostly you. So let's get started. It's funny. I was just thinking, after we talked recently, 2012 was your first vintage, but that to me feels like yesterday. I remember when you brought these wines the first time.
Yeah.
It seems to me like it was like yesterday, and unfortunately, it's not.
I know. I have small children, and for them, time goes by so slowly. And I remember the same for me when I was a kid. And when you get older, time seems to fly faster and faster.
Yeah. I'm curious. Obviously, your family has a long history in California making wine. Originally, I guess in Napa Valley or in and around Napa, and now more on the coast of Sonoma. But tell us a little bit about your history and how you ended up in the business in the first place.
Sure. So my dad, Jason, our history isn't that long, but maybe by California standards, I am second generation. But my dad got into the wine business. He was a lawyer and he just fell in love with wine. He caught the wine bug, which I'm sure many people listening right now can relate to. And he just decided to leave his law career and pursue his dream, which was to make his own mouton or his own Bordeaux style wine in Napa Valley. And he was introduced to the great wines of the world by his father, who took him traveling in France, and they visited Bordeaux and Champagne, and that had a huge impact on him. And so and so he in the early 80s got into the business. He imported a little bit of wine. He sold. He worked at John Walker, that retail store in San Francisco, and he actually after he'd been there for a while, he would sell wine on the phone, stuff like that. So then he even started selling his own wine that he had imported on the phone. When people would call in asking about buying wine. And so he also did a couple of negociant labels. The label was called 5 Palms Cabernet and 5 Palms Chardonnay. And he only made it for maybe 1 or 2 vintages and I'm sure you can imagine, the owners of 3 Palms Vineyard at the time called him up and were like, I don't think so, sir. Maybe not called him up, but maybe sent him a letter from their law firm. And that was my dad. That's my dad. He's like, hey, everybody knows 3 Palms Cabernet. They're going to see this on the shelf, 5 Palms. Well, that's got to be even better. So he made a couple of vintages of that negociant label. But then when he started Pahlmeyer, it was in 1986. It was our Pahlmeyer proprietary red. Randy Dunn was our first winemaker, and then Helen Turley became our winemaker in the 90s, which is where, and I keep saying out of habit, but my family sold the Pahlmeyer brand to Gallo at the end of last year. Anyways, going back to the 90s, Helen Turley was our winemaker. And this was around around this time, my dad had really started to get into red Burgundy and white Burgundy, and just became entranced by those wines, again, as many lovers of wine do. And back then, you could afford these wines. And he would keep leather bound binders with his tasting notes, and he would meticulously record all the information, including the price of these wines. And I mean, it's hardly anything over $15 a bottle, or even $10 a bottle.
Oh my God.
Anyways, so he wanted to, so he decided with Helen that he would buy a vineyard in France and in Burgundy, and get into making Pinot Noir in France. And so he actually, for a very short time, was the owner of a part of Clos de la Roche. And but the French people appealed to an obscure real estate law that gives them, or the local people, that gives them the first right of refusal on sales of these kind. And so this was, again, back in the 90s. And so they had to, so my dad got his money sent back to him, lost his shirt on the exchange rate going back the other way at the time, but had to pick himself up again and figure out how he was going to pursue his passion of getting into Pinot Noir and white Burgundy. And so with Helen being his winemaker at the time at Pahlmeyer, she was a pioneer out on the Sonoma coast with her Marquesan vineyard. I think she probably planted it in the 70s, but she was certainly make her a pioneer out in that area. And so she came across a property called Wayfarer Farm that was not far from her vineyard, but of course it'd probably take about 40 minutes to drive from her property to Wayfarer, because of just the roads are so windy, and you're climbing up mountains and descending mountains just to get, within a few miles. And so this property was owned by a couple, the Davises, and they were hippies, and they had moved out to this remote Sonoma coast as part of the Back to the Land movement of the 60s, late 60s, early 70s. And they were running a small organic farm. And they also had a school out there for wayward children. And anyways, and so they decided, though, that they wanted to sell the land. And so my dad came along and just fell in love with the place. And he bought the property. So this was in the late 90s. And then he got David Abreu, who had just finished developing a vineyard for Pahlmeyer in Napa. And he got him to go out there and develop our vineyard. And so this, I think to this day, is still the only vineyard in Sonoma that David Abreu has developed. But so then we finished planting that vineyard in 2002. And then for several years, we were blending our fruit from the vineyard with some Russian River vineyards, some great Russian River vineyards. Ritchie Vineyard, we were buying Chardonnay from Ritchie, and we were buying Pinot Noir from Hallberg. And that wine, and the wine from Wayfarer, and the fruit from those Russian River vineyards were going into our Pahlmeyer Pinot Noir and our Pahlmeyer Sonoma Coast Chardonnay. And I'd gotten involved in the business then starting in 2008. So just a few years into the Wayfarer project. And so over the years, as I got more involved in the business and really fell in love with Wayfarer, just like my dad had. I really wanted to start a label that just showcased the vineyard for great wines of the world, but in particular for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. It's really, you don't have, the great wines aren't from, this vineyard and that vineyard and a blend of different AVAs. They're really from just one particular site, from exceptional sites, and even blocks within that one exceptional vineyard. And so that's what we wanted to do with Wayfarer, really showcase the vineyard. And so I started with our team the Wayfarer label in 2012 was our first vintage. And so we also had the benefit of being able to start the label, an estate label from a vineyard that was already out of its adolescence as a site, and really starting to show beautiful wines.
Wow. That's such a great story. Let's show the map of where you are exactly, because I think it's fascinating for people to see this whole district. Because this is the Fort Ross Seaview AVA, which is part of what at some point is going to be the West Sonoma Coast AVA. But here we can see where you guys are. You're up here up top, if you can see my mouse. There's McDougall, which is, Jamie Kutch makes that wines, Red Car. Delgado has a vineyard here. Hellenthal, you mentioned, right? Was the one that you were buying fruit from. And then moving south, there's Flowers and Martinelli, Peter Michael, Bohan. So yeah, I mean, this area is so, on a map, things look close, but they're really far away. And there's lots of stretches without any cell phone service. And there's extraordinary views of the ocean.
Mm-hmm.
It's really evocative and wild. I think
It really is. I mean, it's for people that aren't really familiar with, or if you are kind of familiar with this area, some of the landmarks are Jenner, which is a cute little town, Sea Ranch, Timber Cove, and so those are all right along the coast. But then when you start to head inland, you're immediately climbing up steep mountain roads, and all these vineyards are planted up on the ridge lines of the coastal mountain range. And from a helicopter, it kind of almost looks like a golf course, because you just have the greens being just these little vineyards, and then huge swaths of ravines with redwood forests, and just rocky ridge lines. It's incredibly dramatic and beautiful region.
It for sure is. I love it out there. Did you plant the entire vineyard all at once, or was it planted over a long time?
We planted it all at once, so it took a couple of years to plant, but it was everything was planted in the same phase. So as I mentioned, David Abreu developed the vineyard, and so it was divided into 31-acre blocks, and each block is dedicated to a particular rootstock and clone. And so we have 12 different Pinot Noir clones and 6 different Chardonnay clones, and then the really tight vine spacing. And then we're sitting on all Goldrich soil. So Goldrich soil is a huge buzzword in Russian River Valley. It's very prevalent there. But in the Fort Ross Seaview AVA, there's very little spots or sites with this soil type, but we're sitting on all Goldrich soil. And so what that means, it's a mix of sand and clay. So it's really good, well-draining soil, which in this area is really important because, we get, I think 70 or 80 inches of rain a year out here on the coast. So a huge amount of rain. And so you need really well-draining soil. And there's also a mix of clay in that soil, so it doesn't, so we can prevent erosion, and also so then the vines can find areas in the soil where that's holding on to moisture.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating project out here. And so you mentioned that you have 6 different acres of Chardonnay, different clones and rootstocks, but you make only one wine. So whereas your Pinots are more parcellated, they're more divided. Is that because you found that the clones work better together, or are you just not, maybe each single clone isn't quite a complete wine? Because I think in time people may come to think, as I am maybe starting to think, that Chardonnay might be the best grape on the Sonoma Coast, even though it is very widely planted to Pinot Noir. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
Well, I agree. I think Chardonnay is great. And the Chardonnay that we have out at Wayfarer is just remarkable. We just have been making the one blend of Chardonnay. For a big part of the reason is just because we don't have that much planted out there. But we did T-bud over a couple blocks recently so we have 2 more acres. So we now have 8 acres of Chardonnay, and we haven't done our blending for this year because the wines are still finishing malolactic fermentation. But our winemaker, Todd Cohn, who's been with Wayfarer since January of 2013, so just after our first vintage. And he started out as an assistant winemaker, and now he has become our winemaker. And so he hasn't blended the 2019s yet, but we are going to start talking about trying to identify, a couple really special barrels, just to be able to showcase that. But the reason for having all of our different Pinot Noirs is really to showcase the diversity of Pinot Noir. And so we make 5 different Pinot Noirs, all from our one site. And the Wayfarer Vineyard Pinot Noir is our flagship. It's a blend of all 12 clones planted on the site, and it's really meant to just showcase the vineyard.
That's what you call the Wayfarer Vineyard bottling, right? This one.
Exactly. Yeah, that's the Wayfarer Vineyard Pinot Noir. And I know this is it's confusing when you have a winery that even has all sorts of single vineyard wines, but I think it's been proven to be even more confusing when you have just one vineyard that's producing 5 different Pinot Noirs. But the reason we do it is because there's truly so much diversity in these Pinot Noir clones that we just bottle about 100 to 200 cases of each cuvee, and it really just highlights some exceptional blocks in our vineyard and some exceptional clones. And each one has such a unique taste profile and personality that it's just, we really made it for the consumer that wants to geek out on Pinot Noir.
Okay, so walk us through some of the main smaller bottlings. Obviously, you've got your Chardonnay and your estate Pinot, which are the blends, and then you've got some really cool sort of selections, right?
Yeah, so we have Golden Mean, which is a blend of the Pahlmeyer clone and the Swan clone. And so Pahlmeyer is, at least, the thing about clones too, the Pinot Noir clones too, to make them even more confusing, is that they mutate really quickly and really easily. And so when they're planted on a particular site, they can take on a totally different character than even just in a few vineyards over or in a different state. I was at IPNC a few years ago, and they were focusing on clones. And I was one of the panelists, and I was talking about Pahlmeyer, but I was saying totally different things than a winemaker from Oregon, with the way their Pahlmeyer clone was expressed on their vineyard. So that makes it just to add another layer of confusion. But at Wayfarer, Pahlmeyer is very has lots of structure and power, and the Swan is really is a heartbreaker, because it's just so beautiful but so low yielding that it's just hard to even make economic sense to plant more blocks of it. But the Swan is very light and urethral and just the aromatics are incredible, just really floral aromatics. And so the wine is called Golden Mean because it's the beautiful middle between 2 extremes as far as clonal selections go. And Mother Rock is a blend of clones, 37 and Dijon 777, and it's always harvested at the same time and co-fermented. And the blocks that it's planted on have the shallowest soil in the whole property. So only about a meter of soil before the vine roots hit the Mother Rock, or the sandstone substrate of our vineyard. And so this cuvee just showcases a lot of minerality and earthiness and savoriness, and is really delicious. The Traveler is.
Can I ask you a question on this?
Yeah.
So the diagram looks like that's a very steep slope. Is that accurate drawing, or is that just the way it looks on paper?
It is accurate, because the aerial photography that we have, it makes the vineyard look really flat. And so when we drew these illustrations, we wanted to show a little bit more what the slope is. So I think the slopes go up to 20 degrees, I believe. And that side of the vineyard, that section that is east facing, that's also the furthest east section. That has the steepest slopes in the vineyard. The section in the middle that's sloping down towards the pond, those are more gentle slopes. And then on the western section with just a few blocks there, that's a much cooler section of the vineyard. It's closer, it's the furthest west, closest, has most exposure to the coast. And that's all Chardonnay except for the lowest block there is Pinot Noir.
Okay. So, and then the Traveler.
And then the Traveler. So this is rumored, so this is a suitcase clone, rumored to be, and I've never confirmed it, because when it's rumored to be from Domaine de la Romanie Conti Latache. And so when our first winemaker for Wayfarer was Bibiana Gonzalez Rade, who she's married to Jeff Pizzoni of the Pizzoni Vineyards in Santa Lucia Highlands. And so of course they're famous for having suitcase clone that Gary brought back. So she, and lots of vineyards claim to have suitcase clones, and some do, some don't. It's hard to tell. But when she was looking at our block maps when she was first getting started, and she saw this, but we just called this the Wayfarer clone. She said, well, what is this? I mean, so we said, oh, it's a suitcase clone. We think it's this. And she was very skeptical. But it's truly unique clone just in just the morphology of the clusters. They're really big, long, looser clusters, where Pinot Noir generally you have these like little like tight hand grenade kind of clusters. And so this has wings, and it's longer and looser. So the clusters are completely different from anything else we have planted out there. And then the flavor, the taste of this wine is also completely different. It always has the lowest pH of all of our clones, and just really unique aromatics. Always violets in the wine, and just it is truly unique. So we're not exactly sure where the clone came from, but we do know that it's incredibly unique.
And are these clones planted on different rootstocks also? Because I think you said that earlier.
Yeah, there's three different rootstocks throughout the vineyard, but that does make a difference for each clone. So between the 3 different rootstocks and then the 16 different clones, it's one of the main aspects of behind Wayfarer is just the diversity, showcasing the diversity of the site and of the Pinot Noir clones.
And then, but you have some other wines that you make also, or maybe you don't make them anymore, like Pages Ridge. Is that just like occasionally you make that, but not every year? Or
we do make that. We only make a couple barrels of it, and so Pages Ridge, that's the last of the 5 Pinot Noirs, and that is Dijon Clone 667, and it's the most I guess California style of the wines, and we started making it really to kind of have something for our devoted Pahlmeyer Pinot Noir followers, because that wine was going away. But we've continued to make it just because it's so delicious. And that block we ferment in a wood cuve. We just have a couple wood cuves. And then we put it in, and then just the blend is just a few barrels for that block. And so then we'll just bottle 2 barrels every year. And so that's a really delicious wine.
Got it. So for the most part, is the idea to make these wines more or less, the Pinots, more or less the same way so that you really get the differences of each place and each blend? Or is Todd making these wines very differently, sort of according to the site?
I think each different or each lot is brought into the winery separately. And put into tank and kept it separately in tank. So all of the wines do get about a 5 to 7 day cold soak.
Okay.
He will do stem inclusion. We don't do a ton of stem inclusion, but when we have just the right stems, then it'll be a decision made on the sorting line, or when it's picked, that certain lots will get a certain percentage of stem inclusion. And then there's all different types of punch downs that he'll do depending on the clone and what's going on in that tank. And so it's really kind of reading. There's no just one formula that we do for every clone, every block. Everything's really treated as an individual lot. And same with our oak profile. Over the years, we've really honed in on the oaks, or the cooperages and the toast levels that work best for each particular clone, each block. And so that's something that we just continue to refine as we learn more and more about the site and about the different blocks.
Okay. So one of the things that's, I think, very unique about your region that people may not know is that a lot of folks have vineyards out there on the Sonoma coast, but there's no real wineries there because you're too sort of cut off from, you're not really in places that you can just zip down to in 20 minutes or even a half an hour. So your wineries in Santa Rosa, it's very common that wines are made not where the vineyards are. So in this situation now with COVID-19, how are you managing your vineyard and your winery, given that you have an additional challenge, which is a lack of proximity?
Yeah, well, the vineyard is pretty well suited to to being 6 feet apart or social distancing, and so yeah, so we're lucky enough now to have 4 full-time workers at our vineyard, and then we also for particular events in the farming where it's time sensitive and labor intensive, we do bring in crews from a farm labor contractor, and of course they're taking care to follow all the protocols too. So and now what they're doing is even breaking up people, so every other row they'll go through and then they'll go back to the rows that they missed. At the winery right now, luckily it's not harvest and it's not a time with where you need a lot of people in the winery. So we're quite lucky that our winery facility and the vineyard are set up for where you don't have to work in close proximity to other people. And that's also good because, Mother Nature does not wait. It's the vines are growing and, it's, a lot of people are making decisions about their business, related to COVID. And, we don't, in other ways, we don't have the luxury of being able to, save money and not do certain things right now because we have to take the long view, and we have to recognize that the work that we're doing right now, the huge amount of money that we're spending right now is going to be our product that we're selling in 2-3 years. So that's just one thing that makes the wine industry incredibly complicated and difficult to navigate the economic realities sometimes, because you're having to, what you're selling now is based on decisions that you made a few years ago and vice versa.
Yeah, and so that's one of the challenges I think now is that 18 and 19, maybe not so much on the coast, but they're pretty abundant vintages relative to the norm, made in a time that wasn't now in terms of volumes.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that that's a challenge because you have to sell wine today based on decisions that you made a few years ago. And obviously nobody's got the crystal ball. So I think that's a pretty big challenge for smaller states.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly, well, in some ways it's maybe a bigger challenge for larger estates because we're just making wine from our 30-acre vineyard. We didn't get into grape contracts that extend several years. We didn't take advantage of a huge crop to say, oh, let's grab this block and this block too from this other vineyard, or let's buy from this vineyard this year. So because we're restricted to our 30-acre estate, yes, we definitely did have higher yields in 18 because that's just what the vintage brought. But we didn't make a lot more wine than we normally would have just because it is just the 30 acres. So that is definitely challenging to navigate though for other estates though that might have gotten into some more grape contracts while the times were good and now maybe worried about how they're going to sell those wines.
No, for sure. Maybe we should take some questions. I'm curious. I always go and I taste your wines at sort of impartial location, let's say. But so I don't even know the answer to this, but Joey asks, and I don't know, but does Wayfarer have a tasting room, or how does the public taste your wines?
Yeah, so we don't have a tasting room, but we do, if you call or if you're on our mailing list, we can host you in kind of an informal setting. Whether you're in Sonoma or our actual business office is located in downtown Napa. We're even going to try to start, if people happen to be out on the coast, setting up again just informal, come to the vineyard and try some wines there as well. So it's all informal, but if you call, then we'll try to accommodate you.
That sounds great. I think informal is much better. And Don asks, do you have a new rosé? Because even I don't know that. So
I heard the other day that you do not like rosé, so I wasn't going to send you any.
My problems with rosé, Cleo, is I always ask myself, is this what I want to drink more than anything else in the world?
This
is my dilemma. So it's but rosé champagne I make an exception for, but that's always what it comes down to me. It's like, what am I choosing this over? I mean, you can't drink everything. So
you have champagne tastes, and if you also have the champagne budget, then you're all set. But no, I agree. I mean, you can't really beat champagne or a great Chablis or Sancerre or Chardonnay. So, anyways,
but it's not about me. I'm just curious. So what's the deal with the new rosé?
So because my family sold our Pahlmeyer and Jason brands to Gallo last year. And so when we make Wayfarer, we always have a certain percentage of barrels that are deselected from the blend because they're just not the quality or the taste profile that we're looking for Wayfarer. So by taking those barrels out of the blend, we're elevating Wayfarer, but there's still great barrels of wine, and to sell them to another winery to put in their blend, we would lose a lot of money. And so we'll bottle them into another label to make just a little bit of money. Anyway, so that label used to be the Jason wine. So obviously we don't have those anymore. So we're going to introduce WF2, which is going to be Wayfarer's second label. So the first wine was the rosé, the 2019 rosé that we just released. We're almost sold out of. So if you'd like some, we have about 12 more cases left. Okay. But we just made 200 cases of it. And then with the Chardonnay and Pinot Noir that we'll bottle this August and then release about a year from now, the intention is to keep it all DTC and then some for restaurants as well, because otherwise we can't justify the price point. I believe we're going to release them at $40 a bottle. And so with the cost to produce those wines, we can't justify selling them to distributors, except for a small amount for restaurants. So anyway, so that's what we're going to do. It'll be Wayfarer WF2, and you look for it at our, join our mailing list to learn more about those wines.
So the second label will have the rosé and then a Chard and a Pinot?
Exactly.
All from estate fruit?
Yes.
Well, that's pretty cool. That's very cool.
Yeah, we're not looking to buy bulk or source from any other vineyards. Just want to keep it small and grow slowly.
Steve says you'll be happy. I just bought 6 bottles of your Pinots from your website.
Hey, great. Thank you, Steve.
I have fallen in love with, he says, I have fallen in love with Occidental Pinots. Any similarities? If you don't want to answer that, I can answer it.
Oh my God. I love Occidental Pinot Noirs. I've gotten to know, I don't know Steve Kistler, but I've gotten to know his daughter, Catherine, through just the industry. And we actually just had a bottle of that over the weekend. And they just, yes, there's similarities, I would say. Antonio, I heard you talking about how when you taste wines, obviously as a wine critic, you have to talk about the particular flavors and smells, but what you focus on is just like the volume and the length and the texture of the wines. And I do see similarities with Occidental in that regard, as far as just the volume, texture, length in the wines, but they definitely, they come from a totally, or not totally different, but very different area. Occidental, and they just have this like beautiful sort of cranberry acidity to them, and just really juicy and complex and delicious. So I really like them. But of course, I also love the Wayfarer wines, but they're definitely distinctive. I think they have a very different tannin structure, and lots of kind of floral and minerality, floral notes and minerality as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think maybe we should have said this at the beginning, but one of the things that really attracts obviously you and so many other people to this part of California is that there is a very uncanny ability for grapes to get very ripe and to develop intense flavors at relatively low alcohol levels. And as opposed to, let's say, the Russian River, which you mentioned earlier, where the wines just naturally seem to want to be sort of explosive.
Yeah.
And in some places, like in the West Sonoma coast, you can get these wines of tremendous richness and volume, as you were saying, but they're not that ripe. I mean, they feel ripe, but the alcohol numbers are not high. So when I taste, and the reason for people who don't know, the reason why I like to taste for texture and for the shape of the wine is because if I say blueberry, you might say it's lavender, or you might say it's blackberry. These things are very personal. We know we really smell these things. We don't really actually taste them, and we know that. But if I said that this wine is powerful, or if I say it's very perfumed or gracious, probably nine out of 10 people would, even if they don't agree, that they might understand what the description is of the wine, whereas flavors are really subjective. And the other thing I think about textures is that the flavors will transform. I mean, you sent me some wines that are a little bit older, and obviously these flavors evolve over time in a wine, whereas the textures in a wine, they stay more constant. And so I think it's a more useful note or descriptor of a wine when there's a lot of texture. So I try to do that as much as possible. And I think one of the differences is that those Occidental wines are a little bit more opulent and like more fruit intense, and your wines have a little bit more, I think, mineral and aromatic kind of component. They're more lifted. Steve's wines there are really rich I mean, I love those wines, but they're a little bit more creamy in the immediate. But I think also some of the Kistler wines were made from those vineyards when he was at Kistler, but in a different style. So I think the other thing that's just fascinating about all of these labels and wineries is that, this stuff is happening in our generation. This is like generation one, and it's like, we're going to see how these wines develop and age, and there is no 20-year vintage yet,
Exactly.
But,
and also, I mean, as far as viticulture goes, and just knowing where to plant fruit and where to plant vineyards and how to plant them, that's also a learning curve that the California wine industry is going through. And so, yeah, so I mean, I think it's just an exciting time, and it's also exciting to be out in this West Sonoma Coast region, that is just so that's really up and coming in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I'm curious. Because we tape these and we get a lot of viewers from all over the world watching these. But Heiko Jensen asks if your wines are sold in Europe at all.
We do export currently to the UK, Denmark, not a ton, but a little bit. But we're always looking into to finding good importers in European countries. A little bit more historically, obviously Canada, and then in Japan have been the biggest export markets.
Japan's a really big market for a lot of your colleagues. It's really neat.
Yeah, we've been been working with Nakagawa Wine Company for the longest standing relationship of all of our distributors and export partners, and they're really they've really single-handedly really educated the Japanese wine market on California wines, which is very Eurocentric. Also lots of Australian wines, apparently lots of Chilean wines too are going to Japan, but they do a really wonderful job of educating consumers there on California wines and selling them. So
Yeah, whenever we do one of these, there's always somebody like, when are you going to do a seminar in London? When are you going to do this or that? Trust me, I can't wait to go start traveling again. But I think that there's a lot of interest and it's fantastic. For people who don't know, I think one of the things that's really interesting, Scott and Vicky asked this, but you're really just a few miles away from the ocean. So how far is Wayfarer from the Pacific as far as the crow flies?
Yeah, we're less than 5 miles. I think it's like 3 or 4 point something, and I can't remember the exact distance right now, but that's something that's really interesting. What's that?
Nothing. It's a few miles.
Yeah. So, but within the Fort Ross Seaview AVA, you really see a lot of diversity between the sites. And what I found is that the vineyards that are closer to the ocean, like only 1 mile away or a couple miles away, have very different profiles from vineyards like Wayfarer that are more protected. Like Marquesan is kind of down in a ravine. It doesn't have a ton of exposure, and those wines are known for being very opulent and rich. Wayfarer is definitely, it's a warm site in an otherwise really cool region. And we're 2 ridge lines in, so we're more protected, and so we're really able to achieve like just beautiful phenolic ripeness, which of course is subjective, but vintage after vintage. And then sites that are closer to the ocean just have more exposure, and you can taste it in the wines.
Yeah, and you have to be at 1,100 feet, right, to be in
above 920 feet. So below that elevation, the Fort Ross Seaview AVA is redwood forests and ravines, and the plantable areas are just above that 920 feet elevation.
Yeah, so you're pretty close to the ocean and pretty high up.
Yeah. So cool air and a ton of sunlight.
Yeah. So a lot of times people don't really focus on sunlight, but the luminosity is really important in a lot of wines.
It is really important, and that's also what I've learned recently, because I'm always learning something new when I'm with our winemaker, who's also our vineyard manager in the vineyard, and things I learned from Bibiana when she was our winemaker. But the sunlight really affects tannin structure in the wines. I think that's also, that structure, I think, is something that's also really notable about our wines, and not something that you necessarily think of with Pinot Noirs, but certainly a very important component of Pinot Noirs.
So I'm curious, because you sent me a couple of older wines to taste, including starting with the 2014 Chardonnay, which is funny because in California, these wines are, there's the vintage and then the wine gets bottled in August, you said, right? Usually it used to be
we barrel for 15 months. So this one it's bottled in December.
And like a lot of times I'll taste them right after bottling. And I don't have a chance to taste these wines after 5 or 6 years. So it's really interesting to do that. But what do you think the optimal drinking window is for your wines?
Yeah. So, well, first of all, I was excited when I decided to send you some older, or some vintages with a little bit of age on them. Again, we can't go too far back because 12 is our first vintage, but for the Chardonnay, the drinking window is very personal. I think for me though, I love drinking wines young. I think you decant them. You can decant your Chardonnays. You should, if you're drinking them right away. Anyways, but so I do love drinking the wines young. But I think that after about 5 or 6 years, the Chardonnay really just opens up, and it's just really beautiful. You're not really getting any aged notes on it, which I don't particularly like in Chardonnays, or in domestic Chardonnays, but the wine's just so open and generous after about 5 years in bottle.
Yeah, for people who maybe haven't had a chance to taste this wine yet, this wine, site notwithstanding, has always been made in a little bit of a tighter style than the Chardonnay that maybe people might have tasted from Pahlmeyer, which obviously has a longer track record. That was always, like more New Oak and the toasted heads and the whole deal, right?
Yeah, 100% Francois Ferrer, heavy toasted heads. Yeah. That's the Pahlmeyer. and honestly, it's delicious. But the Wayfarer Chardonnay is, I mean, of course I'm biased, but I just love it. I think it has all that generosity, but just zippy acidity, and it's just, this vintage is about 65% new French oak, which has been pretty consistent over the last
We're
years.
talking about the 2014 here.
14, yeah.
Yeah.
So the 65% new French oak, which is pretty typical. But with our wines, we're using different. We do use some Francois Ferrer, but a lot of other cooperages, more medium toast levels versus the heavy toast. And all of that, it just works so well with the Chardonnay that we get out at our vineyard on the coast. So.
Got it. And then what about the Pinots? What's your preference for drinking those?
So, I mean, we're only going back to 2012 here. So I don't think what we wanted to do with Wayfarer is really make wines that are built for aging, which I think, when you think about red Burgundy, you would dream of opening up, those wines young. In fact, we went there a few years ago, and my husband popped into one of the local bottle shops, and we were buying a few cases of wine because we were out there with a group of people. We had rented a house, and the store owner would only sell us certain bottles because he knew we were going to drink them like that week. And so he said, "No, I'm not selling that one to you because we'll ship it home for you. But I'm not going to sell this to you." And so he wouldn't even sell us the wines because they weren't ready to drink them.
Drink it when you get home the next day. But
I know. So with the beautiful thing about California wines is that you really can drink them right on release, and they're delicious. But the 13 vintage, I sent you the 13 Traveler. I mean, that is a vintage also with huge tannin structure. And these wines are really just starting to just sing. And so, I mean, so it hasn't even been 10 years yet, but I can see drinking these wines for at least another 10, 15 years. But they're certainly drinking really beautifully right now with a few years, 5-7 years of age on them.
Yeah, so the 16 you sent me is the Wayfarer vineyard. So if we were tasting all the 16s, do you find, I mean, I know there's not a ton of track record, but do you find that the wines age more according to the personality of the vintage, or do the different cuvées have their own personality?
Yeah. So far, it's been more about the personality of the vintage. I think the 13s are going to age for a really long time. The 14s is for Wayfarer, at least, we're just pretty open and generous in the beginning, but still tasting delicious. So I think at least right now it's just vintage to vintage. They all kind of have a different character in their evolution, but that is something I really hadn't thought of before. But you bring up a really good point. In 10 years from now, which of the special cuvées are going to be the most ageable, and what's the right drinking window for each of those clonal selections.
Well, it'll be fun to taste and see. Roger has a great question, which is, he says, I had an 05 Pahlmeyer Pinot last week. The wine was drinking great, lots of life left. Where in Sonoma did those grapes come from? Do you remember?
Yeah, so that is mostly, it was from Hallberg Vineyard, because 05 was our first vintage with fruit off of Wayfarer. So Hallberg is a great vineyard in Russian River Valley. It's definitely a Russian River Valley profile, and those wines were all Francois Ferrer oak as well.
So 05 would have been mostly Hallberg.
Yes.
And maybe a little bit of Wayfarer, or not, maybe not.
Maybe a little bit, but they were young vines, so I'm not sure.
Okay. This is a really cool question too from Jonathan, which is, once you pick the grapes, how do they get to the winery, and how long does it take? Are you able? I'm sure you're able to keep the fruit cool. You're probably picking in the morning, I would imagine, like most people. But
yeah, that's a really good question. So we'll start our picks depending on how big the pick will be. We'll start them maybe around 10 p.m. or midnight. And so we're really harvesting in the cool of the night, and that's really important for a lot of reasons, but one of them is definitely because they're going to have that truck ride to the winery. So one important thing to note is that we're the first, there's no other stops. They go straight to the winery, and they'll arrive around 6 a.m. And so it takes, so just driving in a car from the winery to the vineyard, it takes an hour and a half. But in a truck, it probably takes a little bit longer in one of those big trucks. And
then I imagine it gets processed pretty much right upon receipt, correct?
Exactly. It'll get processed right away. Yeah, so we'll so depending on what it is, we'll either we mostly destem the fruit, but first we'll sort the clusters. Any clusters that will be whole cluster fermentation will get pulled out, and then the wines, then the clusters will go into the destemmer, and then we sort the berries, and then the berries are put into a tank. They're not pumped, they're dumped into a tank for about 5 to 7 day cold soak. And then following that, they'll ferment for about 2 weeks before we put them in barrel.
All right. And then Sid has a question about the Chardonnays. I remember there was a time when the Chardonnays, they weren't fined or filtered at all. Sometimes they could be a little cloudy and hazy, which was a style, but a lot of people have sort of moved away from that. Is Wayfarer, I don't see that at all in this wine that's 5 years old, but is that just because you're making the wines a little bit differently now, or is it just that site tends to give wines that are a little bit more brilliant naturally?
Yeah, so our Chardonnay is not fined or filtered, but our winemaker is incredibly obsessive and meticulous. And so, you know, you'll see that the wine is clear, or maybe you can't see it very well, but then that's just very careful racking. So what that means is the Chardonnay won't go to a tank after, it'll go straight, the clusters will get sorted, and then it'll go straight into a press. And it's a bladder press. It's a different, it's a gentle press. They use it in Champagne and for Chardonnay and other white varieties. And so the juice will get pressed immediately when it's still really cold, and then it'll be put into barrels. And then in the barrels, it'll the wine will settle, and it'll start fermentation. But to help fermentation along, you'll be stirring the barrels. But then at a certain point, you're not going to stir them. You're just going to let all of the yeast and all of the stuff in there that a winemaker could tell you a lot more about just settle to the bottom of the barrel. And then when you get the wine out, it's called racking. So you'll rack, and then you'll clean out the barrels and then return. But I did forget one really important step there. So I'm gonna back up a second. Once we press the wine, we will put it into a tank and let it settle overnight. So just overnight, the wine will just be in a stainless steel tank, and then all of the stuff that were on the skins of the grapes will come to the bottom of the tank. And then you rack it to barrel. But then we have, those are called lees that are down at the bottom, and that's where you get all the yeast, all the native yeast and stuff. So then we'll take the good lees, there's apparently good lees and bad lees, and then which adds so much beautiful character to the wine. So we'll very carefully just take the good lees, which are kind of like yellowy orangey color, and then we'll put a little bit into each barrel to help with the native fermentation.
And it's 100% Malo for the Chardonnay?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. A couple of people have asked, so I'm just curious, do you have any experimentation with other grape varieties, or is it just Chardonnay and Pinot?
We have not, but my husband and I would love to just plant like a ½ acre of Syrah out there, so that we have something to eat with steak in the winter. But anyways, I think there's some, we have to find the right clonal material, because that's really important. But if we can find the right clonal material, I think we'll T-bud over ½ of an acre to Syrah, and maybe, and see how that goes. And it would probably just offer it to our mailing list.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely some really interesting Syrahs out there. I think Pei makes some amazing Syrahs. Both of them are just fantastic.
Yeah,
Red Car also.
And I also really like Fela's Syrah.
It has a couple, including that one from the tight spaced vineyard.
Yeah, well, the one I'm thinking of, I think, is from their estate vineyard, which is out in the Fort Ross CPU.
As I recall, they make two from the estate, one that's Syrah and then one that's meter by meter. But you know, Aaron makes like 50 wines.
No better than me.
Anymore. It's just like every year, it's like, oh my God, how many wines? But it's a fun thing. But yes, I think that one is meter by meter, and I think it's from the estate, but I'm not sure. But for sure, there are some really interesting wines out there, which though leads me to an inevitable question, which is, what is the how is climate change impacting your particular region? Obviously, you've only been out there, for a short period of time relative to the history of wine, but have you observed any changes just in the time you've been out there?
That's a really good question, and time is really gonna tell. But I mean, certainly the drought was a symptom, if you will, of climate change. The drought that we had that started, I think, in 2011 or so, and lasted several years. So that was definitely a big deal. We do get a lot of rainfall out there, though. So and we do have irrigation. So we only use the irrigation if we really need it, and we really want to encourage the vines to send their roots deep into the soil. And if the block, the way we have the irrigation set up is we can just water the top of a block or the bottom of the block, just depending on the need, because generally the tops of the block will need more water because the soil is a lot shallower.
Yeah, so can I jump in and explain something just for people who may not know the technicalities? If you irrigate, then what you're talking about is that the vines don't go deep into the soil for nutrients. They become sort of lazy and accustomed to having everything given to them.
Yeah.
So what you're talking about is irrigating just only when you absolutely have to, and training those vines to go deep into the soils to get their nutrients, which is much better for wine quality, right?
Yeah, and just the longevity of your vineyard too. And when we do irrigate, we'll do long irrigations, which means you're not just doing a little bit of water on the surface, you're doing a lot of water that's going to go deep down to where the roots hopefully are, ideally where they are. So that's definitely an important aspect too. So when we have had heat waves out at the vineyard, we can irrigate, and so we'll, if we know in advance when the heat wave's coming, if we can irrigate in the right way, then we're not going to have as much dehydration. The vines won't shut down and stop ripening, and so that's definitely been important for us. I mean, luckily we are out on the coast in a cooler region, so when climate change it's coming whether we like it or not. I mean, so it won't affect us quite as quickly as maybe some other regions, but it's certainly something to certainly something to add it to the list of things to worry about when you're in the wine business.
What about other blocks on the property? Is there land that can still be planted, or is it all planted?
We have a neighbor where we might lease some land in our just next door neighbor right there. So we might expand the vineyard, plant a little bit more acreage out there. But again, I just want to grow really slowly and respond to demand versus the other way around. Just want to be really intentional about how we grow. Another thing that is something that is for my husband and me that we is a kind of a dream of ours that is certainly in no plans for it to materialize anytime soon, but we would love to plant a vineyard in Oregon. And this isn't about jumping on the Oregon bandwagon. Oregon actually, well, I mean, we've loved Oregon Pinot Noirs and Chardonnay, I have to say. In fact, I mean, Oregon is definitely known for its Pinot Noir, but I really love some of the Chardonnays coming out there, even more than the Pinot Noirs in a lot of cases. But my husband and I both grew up on the Oregon coast, and that's where we met as children, actually. And we own a home out there now that was his family home growing up in a tiny little town called Neskowin, which is about 45 minutes from Minville, which is the heart of wine country out there. Yeah. And so, we'd love to maybe plant a vineyard in Oregon and kind of have a similar small estate project up there, like what we've done like what my dad started with Wayfarer.
Well, that's a lot of flying in small planes or helicopters, probably.
Ideally, it beats the 10-hour drive.
Great. Well, Cleo, thanks so much for your time. I mean, the way that you can explain things with such clarity is really, I mean, it makes it just so easy to understand everything. Thanks to everybody who watched for all your great questions. I think it's a great way to start the week. Happy Monday. Thanks, Cleo. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much. Happy Monday.
Bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.